Welcome back to Christian Questions on News Talk 102.7 WM. Our subject this morning, God ever advocates slavery? To be a part of our program, call 860-442-6102. That's 442-6102.
And, Jonathan, you're breaking up just a little bit, so just keep that in mind. You might want to move to the other side of the room or something. But we are in the middle of putting together an understanding of scriptural servitude laid out just purely from a scriptural perspective. And so far, what we've seen is servants were of two types, some that were born in the house and some that were bought with money. Let's go through a few more scriptures as we look at the servitude, especially in the context of Abraham.
All right, Rick, let's read Genesis 24, verses 1 through 4. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham said to his servants, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but will go to my country and to my kindred, and get a wife for my son Isaac.
So here, Abraham is putting Eliezer in a position of great responsibility to go and get a wife for his son, so he can continue their line and their heritage. Next scripture.
Genesis 17, verses 24 and 27. And Abraham was 90 years old and 9, when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money of a foreigner, were circumcised with him.
And that's interesting, Jonathan, because the rite of circumcision was something that was very, very important, and it separated the lineage of Abraham from all other races, if you will, and put them in the context of being favored of God. So you have the servants in the house falling under that same context, and I think that's an interesting and an important point. Let's go on to this next little section, and Jonathan, if you would, read the whole thing down on the bottom there.
Sure. There is a clear distinction between the servants of Abraham and the things which constituted his property or wealth. Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold, and we find that in Genesis 13, verses 2 and verse 5. But when the patriarch's power or greatness is spoken of, then servants are spoken of as well as the objects which constituted his riches. And that's found in Genesis 24, verses 34 and 35.
All right. Okay. Go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
So there's a difference, and this is an important point, I think, Jonathan. There's a difference in describing Abraham. When it describes his wealth and his property, it describes property. But when it describes his greatness, it describes his household as well as his property. So let's look at some scriptures that give us a sense of that, because I think that's a very important distinction as we lay out servitude, especially in the Old Testament.
All right, let's read Genesis 13, verses 1 and 2. So Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. Okay,
so you have a statement, he was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So he was a wealthy man, all right? Now, when you go down to Genesis 24, you alluded to that earlier, Genesis 24, 34 to 35, it's talking about more than being rich. Let's read that one.
And he said, I am Abraham's servant, and the Lord hath blessed my master greatly, and he has become great, and he hath given him flocks and herds and silver and gold and men servants and maid servants and camels and asses.
So here you have Abraham being described as a great man. So there's a difference in the description of being rich or being wealthy and a description of his greatness. And the difference is the description of the household, including the men and women that were serving him, along with the other things that he had. One other scripture in relation to Isaac in the same context, Jonathan.
Genesis 26, 12 through 14. Then Isaac sowed in that land, and received in the same year 100-fold. And the Lord blessed him, and the man waxed great, and went forward, and grew until he became very great. For he had possession of flocks, and possession of herds, and great store of servants, and the Philistines envied him.
So again, here, Jonathan, it's interesting that it's talking about possession of flocks, possession of herds, but a great store of servants. And that word for servants is the word that's used for slaves. So the point we're making here is early on, when we have servitude in the Old Testament, it is not in the context of property, so to speak. It's spoken of in a different light. It's spoken of in terms of greatness rather than your riches. So again, folks, if you have a thought, it's 860-442-6102. That's 442-6102. And folks, if you do call, keep in mind that just due to our phone system limitations, you just might have to let the phone ring a minute or two, and we're just going to end up having to put you right on because Jonathan is calling in from a distance. So, Jonathan, now let's go through and read one more paragraph from McClintock and Strong's and see if we can tie this part up.
In no single instance do we find that the patriarchs either gave away or sold their servants, or purchased them of third persons. Abraham had servants bought with money. It has been assumed that they were bought of third parties, whereas there is no proof that this was the case. The probability is that they sold themselves to the patriarchs for an equivalent, that is to say, they entered into voluntary engagements to serve him for a longer or shorter period of time, in return for the money advanced them. It is a fallacy to suppose that whatever costs money is money or property. The children of Israel were required to purchase their firstborn. They were, moreover, required to pay money for their own souls, and when they set themselves or their children apart by vow unto the Lord, the price of release was fixed by statute.
Okay, so this is an important point, because what this is saying is in the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this is what we call the pre-Mosaic era, the servitude of one man to another was not in the context of a person being bought or sold by a person from a third person. Okay, so to make this clear, Jonathan, if I was the person who was to be the servant or the slave, you would not buy me from Fred. Okay. That's what we're talking about here. Instead, I would sell myself into your servitude because of debt or poverty or some circumstance so that I could survive.